must confess, looking around at the room, I feel absolutely overwhelmed. I just hope to God that you won't leave the room saying, "What a bore, what a waste of time." But let me begin by offering my grateful thanks to the organizers of the Kapilavatsyan Memorial Lecture for doing me the honor of inviting me to give this lecture. It is indeed a great privilege. I first met Dr. Vatsyayan as a student when I briefly joined Miranda House in 1951. She was teaching English literature, which I read as a subsidiary course, and we had some very lively discussions on literary writing, among which I particularly remember the one on Christopher Marlowe and his plays, The Elizabethan Playwright. We didn't see eye to eye at all on Marlowe. Subsequently, we occasionally met in passing when she was associated with the India International Center, and I was then for a few months working in the library. And our passing chats were always brief, but full of fun and ideas. And I must confess that when I occasionally now come to the library and walk past, I miss those chats. For this occasion and this lecture, it was suggested to me that I should speak on history, or rather the contentious relationship that has now developed between professional history writing and that which goes by the name of history on various kinds of media, often written, it seems, by those unfamiliar with the historical method. Barring a few exceptions, much that they say tends to be the version of those who interpret the past as they wish, even if lacking proven evidence. It is therefore unacceptable to professional historians, but it is acceptable to members of the public who in turn quote it, perhaps because of the generally scant knowledge of history in this country. The sciences, being more technical, are not fantasized. The social sciences analyze how society functions and are therefore less technical and therefore more vulnerable. And history, of course, is an easy prey. I would like to argue that in this non-professional history, it is not limited to just the interpretation of history, as is popularly taught. There are at least 3 other areas affected. These are in the concepts we use to define our cultural heritage, in the propagation of poor quality history that quite alarmingly is contributing to lowering our educational standards, and in the political role of the ideology that is seeking to govern us. Without sounding alarmist, I believe that there should be a much fuller and sharper understanding of the kind of impact made on the thinking of our society from non-professional historical thinking or others, and why these ideas are being propagated. Professional history in India over the past half-century has undergone an immense change, both in the range and methods of analyzing sources and in explanations of what happened in the past. Historical research now goes far beyond dynastic history and incorporates aspects of social, economic, cultural, and environmental history. This increase in curiosity about the past, different aspects of the past, and the world we live in, therefore, is understandable and welcome. But answers have to be based on proven evidence, not on guesses and fantasies. History is no longer just an aspect of Indology, that is, providing information on the past. It is now an analytical discipline explaining the complexities of the past. And these concern not only the what and the where of past events, but also now the how and the why of what happened. Answering new questions has led to the emergence of new methods of both obtaining data and investigating it. This involves fresh interpretations that often question older knowledge. When existing interpretations become invalid, they are discarded by professional historians, as, for example, some long-held colonial readings of the Indian past. History helps us clarify what we call our cultural identity. This is central to the perception of who we are and what we are about, which in turn is pivotal to our understanding of ourselves and our cultures, in fact, our pattern of living. Stories about the past have been propagated in various ways in a variety of texts. Initially, the past was narrated as part of an oral tradition of what was believed might have happened. Some were then recorded as literature. Categories of texts in Sanskrit and Prakrit closer to history were the Charitas, biographies, such as the famous Bhanabhatta's Harsha Charita, and the Vamshavalis, or chronicles of regions and dynasties, the best known being Kalhana's Rajatarangani. And complementing these, in the second millennium AD, were the Tarikh, the chronicles written in Persian, such as the Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi. However, when it came to explaining the past, the deeper imprint was the colonial reconstruction of the Indian past to begin with. European readings of Asian history were obsessed by what they called Oriental despotism. Colonial writers maintained that the earlier rulers were despots, governing impoverished peasants through an oppressive bureaucracy. They argued that there was no notion of a state, since authority was in the hands of the despot. And these despots did not claim any legitimacy from the past. Therefore, history was not required. And given the absence of historical writing, obviously, colonial authority had to sit and write the history of India in accordance with what they believed it to be. And that's very important, the bias that comes into colonial writing. So the writing of Indian history began with colonial theories about the Indian past. Two theories in particular, which seem to be non-dying, were deeply ingrained and initially shaped Indian history. These were the Aryan theory of race, and the two-nation theory. The Aryan theory assumes that history began when the subcontinent was settled by the Aryans, a superior race of migrants from Central Asia, it was argued. Upper caste Hindus claim descent and cultural origins, and Hinduism claims its roots from the Aryans. The other theory was, of course, the much better known two-nation theory, initially set out, and this is important to keep in mind, initially set out by James Mill in 1817 and thereabouts, the early 19th century. It was among the earliest theories of Indian history. It stated that India consisted of two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, and that they were permanently hostile to each other. This theory ignored the fact that a nation depends on drawing diverse people together, whereas religion segregates them according to belief. These are two contrary processes, but they've been bundled into one by James Mill. Can nationalism, therefore, be qualified by a religious identity? And the communal interpretation which developed out of this two-nation theory was that the religious aggression between Hindus and Muslims explained the history of the second millennium AD. These interpretations of Indian history, the two interpretations, were questioned half a century ago by professional historians and a few others, and have been completely discarded by professional historians. However, these theories have been kept alive at the popular level, propagated in Hindutva ideology, and among some such popularizing views. They express them not in professional journals, but on various media. In professional circles, little attention is given to statements not backed by the required proven evidence. And neither of these theories initially were backed by very much evidence, except what the text said. What replaced these two theories among professional historians were various other explanations based explicitly on evidence that was verified and analyzed. There was a move away from colonial views that focused only on dynastic and political history and included other aspects of social and political functioning. This yielded other readings. Two substantial changes in professional history were linked to researching history. One was the use of a historical method, as we call it, as a procedure for research, and the second was interdisciplinary research leading to fresh sources and fresh questions. What do I mean by the historical method? It is the orderly investigation, step by step, of a historical problem. The first step in the collection is the collection of data from a range of sources, some of which may not have been consulted previously or been examined from diverse perspectives. The data must come from verified evidence. It cannot be hearsay on social media, WhatsApp, or whatever, or the wishful thinking of the writer concerned. The sources, both texts and artifacts from archaeology, must be studied and analyzed. This is particularly important where sources are in more than one language. Much of medieval history was earlier called the Muslim period, after the periodization of James Mill, and much of it was therefore based on Persian sources. Texts in Sanskrit and the regional languages are now being consulted more extensively, yielding differences in ways of thinking historically about those times, contradicting the colonial and subsequent communal interpretations. After assembling the evidence, the historian, the both causal and explanatory connections between people and events can then be examined by the historian. First the evidence, then comes the analysis and examination. These connections must draw on logical and rational arguments, not on guesses and probabilities dictated by the preferences of the writers. Seeking explanations from reading a text means an intensive study of the sources. Multiple questions are asked of these, such as, who was the author? Did his background influence what he wrote? Did he have an agenda? Was the agenda successfully conveyed by the text? Who was the audience for whom he wrote? Very important. The royal court, or a monastic community, or the larger public, because the orientation would change somewhat in accordance with the audience. Such questions are generally not centrally addressed in what claims to be history on the social media. This is perhaps because both the questions and the answers require a thoughtful reading and knowledge of the sources, as the answers can be very complicated. The induction of interdisciplinary history, that is, history moving out to other disciplines and having conversations with other disciplines, that helped in handling historical evidence, and this was done through more data and fresh questions. Historians became aware of methods of analysis used in other disciplines that could also be useful in historical research. For early history, this is particularly important because in addition to archaeology, which is an obvious aid, companion to history, some comparative use of analysis from linguistics or social anthropology are occasionally very suggestive, such as in discussing patterns of living and in defining cultures. Currently, there is also evidence from environmental studies and genetics. Genetics is the latest in the field. All this makes the analysis of the evidence not only richer, but much more insightful. For instance, religions are no longer viewed in splendid isolation, as they were until recently. They are now seen as closely related to the kind of societies in which they flourished. Hence, the many differences between one religion and another, depending on the society that it comes from. And this might help explain the form that they took, the kind of patrons they had, very important in religious studies, and their propagation.